All right, I've got 10 a.m. Central Time. So we're going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. My name is Peter Kingsmill. I'm the Key Biodiversity Area Assessment and Outreach Coordinator at WCS Canada. I'm coming live from sunny Ottawa on Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And everybody joining at the moment, I'd encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're coming from, who you're working with, what your interest is in KBAs, and whose lands and territories you're working and living on. So drop that in the chat if you'd like. I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll turn it over to the stars of today. We have a great lineup of speakers to kick off this Saskatchewan kickoff meeting. And so just to touch those few housekeeping items before then, we'll be recording the talk, the entire webinar today, and posting it on our KBA Canada website afterwards, so you can go back and watch that at your leisure. The questions, you'll note that you don't have the ability to unmute or turn on your video yet. We'll enable that at the end of the talk when the question period begins, just to reduce distractions and let everybody focus on the great speakers we have here today. So if you have questions, note them down, drop them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations, or hold them on and you'll be able to ask them yourself at the end as well. On that note, without further ado, let me turn it over to the Director of the Canada Key Biodiversity Areas Program, Dr. Ciara Raudsepp-Hearne at WCS Canada. Ciara, take it away.
Thanks very much, Peter. Should I be sharing my screen? Or okay, you'll do that. Okay, super. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Key Biodiversity Area program nationally, and I won't get into too many details because others will get into some of those details, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So please make note of any questions that you have, and we'll be happy to answer them at the end. You can go to the next slide. So key biodiversity areas are something very specific. The definition of a key biodiversity area is a site that contributes significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. So it's not just sort of areas that people are in discussion about and they kind of think they should be recognized as places that are important for biodiversity. There are very specific criteria under which a site can qualify as a key biodiversity area. Move to the next slide. And these are the criteria. So there are 5 of them, and each of the criteria has sub-criteria as well. So criterion A, a site can qualify for threatened biodiversity. That includes species or threatened ecosystems. Criterion B, a site can qualify for geographically restricted biodiversity. So these species or ecosystems don't have to be threatened in any way. They just have to be very clumped in space and quite rare. So an example of a geographically restricted ecosystem is an Alvar Ecosystem, which has been recently identified in Saskatchewan. Criterion C are sites with very, very high ecological integrity, and they are large sites, so 10,000 square kilometers. It's pushing the boundaries of what might be considered a site, and they're places with minimal industrial human impact and high biotic integrity measured in the ways that we're currently exploring. And these will mostly be in northern Canada. In the south, our landscapes are too fragmented to be able to sustain, for example, natural fire regimes. Criterion D are sites where species, so this is just focused on species, this one, where they aggregate in large numbers at a certain point in their life cycle. So examples are migratory staging sites, and there are many already identified in Saskatchewan for birds by Birds Canada's initiative to identify important bird and biodiversity areas over the past several decades. And I know Nature Saskatchewan has been involved in that as well, and many other partners. But also under criterion D, you might identify a key biodiversity area for caribou, for example, a caribou calving area, or snake hibernacula or bat hibernacula. So there's a number of different ways that a site can be identified that way. Criterion E is one that we're not using so much. It's kind of identifying the same types of sites using irreplaceability analysis, but the methods aren't very highly developed, so we won't be looking at that for the moment. I put an example threshold just so that you know that it's not that easy to meet the criteria. There are, so for example, under criterion A1, so that's a sub-criterion that I was talking about, if a species is critically endangered or it's G1 under the NatureServe threat system ranking, you need 0.5% of the global population at the site for that site to qualify as a key biodiversity area. So another criterion example under criterion B1, which is a geographically restricted species, you don't need it to have a threatened species there, but you need but you do need 10% of the global population of the species that has to be present at the site for it to qualify under criterion B1. So that just means that it's really clumped. That site is disproportionately important to the survival of that species. Next. We can go into those details later if you want, and Michael is going to, Michael Rudy, who's the Saskatchewan KBA Coordinator, will talk to you a little bit about some places where those thresholds are being met. We follow, in order to identify sites in a really robust way, in a really credible way, so that all stakeholders will trust the results, we follow the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. So this was a global standard that was developed over the course of 12 years and only recently published in 2016. So if you haven't heard of Key Biodiversity Areas, that's because it's a pretty new tool, and Canada is one of the first countries to really be making a huge effort to identify all key biodiversity areas across the country. We've also developed a conservative adaptation of the global standard, and so we've developed a national key biodiversity area standard to ensure that some biodiversity elements of conservation concern in Canada are included. And so that includes, so the global standard only looks at full species, the national standard looks at populations and infraspecies. So that's just one example of a difference, but we can go into that more later too. Next. So why are we doing this at all? So we know that Canadian biodiversity is in decline. Biodiversity is in decline everywhere in the world. Key drivers include habitat loss and disturbance. And key biodiversity areas so far, so there's been a lot of work with governments at all scales and stakeholders and rights holders across Canada. And we found that key biodiversity areas are seen as a very scientifically robust and credible tool that capture a range of biodiversity values and can inform a range also of conservation decisions and actions. The Pathway to Canada Target 1, which is a national initiative to try to meet biodiversity targets at the, that they've signed on to at the global scale, has called on all jurisdictions to identify key biodiversity areas in their territory. So key biodiversity areas are a tool for conservation that have some specific qualities that I'm just going to quickly go through. It's really important to know that this is just an information layer. There's no management that comes along with putting these boundaries on sites that are considered key biodiversity areas. There's no impact on access to land. It can feed into any kind of conservation or planning decision. So there's no immediate risk of doing this work. It's really to provide a tool that everyone can trust to say, these are really unique and remarkable sites for biodiversity. And, give that to any stakeholder that wants that information, and they will know the conservation context best, not us, and they will be able to figure out, well, what is the most appropriate conservation action or stewardship action for that place. So it could include land use planning that considers these areas, or it could be the development of new protected areas, but it could also just be local stewardship of these sites. It's not negotiated, and that's why it's also trusted. A site either meets the criteria or it doesn't, so it either is or is not a key biodiversity area. The process is regionally focused, so we do believe that people in Saskatchewan, for example, know the conservation context, the biodiversity and the landscapes better than anyone who's working centrally or at the national scale. So we hire people who are experts in those areas, and we reach out to networks of experts and knowledge holders within those areas to find out, how do we go about doing this work in a way that will be most relevant. A few other little points about key biodiversity areas. A site can be any size. It could be, we have sites that are, a kilometer squared up to several hundred kilometers squared. I'd say the average is about, 50 to 100 square kilometers for a site. All of the information that we develop will be publicly available to anyone who wants to request the spatial information and the accompanying information about the key biodiversity area. It's being used as a global and national indicator, the key biodiversity areas, of the effectiveness of protected areas and sort of where where biodiversity is and how effectively it's being managed and stewarded. And the other thing it does is that, in some places we're identifying key biodiversity areas in places where people already know that there's fantastic biodiversity, but it draws attention nationally and globally to where these unique biodiversity values occur. And in some cases, we're drawing attention to species and ecosystems that nobody has paid attention to. Sites for rare plants that, they're not caribou, they're not as charismatic, so people haven't paid as much attention. The Key Biodiversity Area tool sort of draws attention to frogs and sedges and mosses, as well as, caribou and all these wonderful ecosystems like Alvar Ecosystems. Next. So this is what the structure looks like at the national scale. We have, so these are just a couple of the logos of our partner organizations, but actually at this point we have hundreds of individuals and dozens of organizations that have participated. The work is jointly run by WCS Canada, Birds Canada, and NatureServe Canada, in order to build on the wonderful legacy of the Important Bird Area program from Birds Canada, and we're building up from there, because so important bird areas are being transitioned to key biodiversity areas, and that will be part of this family of key biodiversity areas that have all been identified with the same approach. This is where we're at pretty much, and so I'm going to wrap up in a minute. We have a lot of sites in progress across Canada. This map actually includes both the new sites that we've identified across the country. So there's about 250 as we're slowly working across the country, depending on where we've had success fundraising for regional coordinators and for processes to begin. And there's a good 450 previously known as important bird areas that are being transitioned to key biodiversity areas, and that work is ongoing because all those sites have to be reviewed by experts and new data brought in. So this is what the map looks like at the moment. We're adding to this on a weekly basis. There's no difference between the red and the yellow. We've just added a little yellow buffer around the sites that are so small that you can barely see them on a map at this scale. Next. And finally, I'm going to switch over now to the next speaker, but I'm going to end just to say that the process that we've put together is extremely participatory, and we've started to do all the work of scoping out where are the key biodiversity areas in Saskatchewan. And you're going to hear from Michael Rudy, who's the person coordinating this work in Saskatchewan. But just to say that there's a lot of different opportunities to get involved, both as species experts, landscape experts. You can get involved at any stage, or you can just stay informed. And so we do have a survey that we've sent out in the invitation to this event. And it would be great if you are interested in getting information or being involved. If you're a species expert or an ecosystem expert, it would be great if you could just go. It's only a few questions long. You just write your name and your contact information and what you're particularly interested in how you're interested in participating. So there's the part of the work that's identifying the actual sites and sort of scoping out the species, and is there enough data and how do we interpret the data. But then you also, once the proposal is created, we have multiple rounds of review. So we have expert review, people who really know the species or the ecosystems. And then once that is finished and we're pretty happy with the sites, we have a broader stakeholder review. So that's anyone who's interested in sort of seeing before these are finalized and may have some more information to add. We invite anyone to weigh in with any form of knowledge is appropriate for this process. So I'll end there, and just to say thank you all very much for coming today, and I hope that we have some great discussions at the end. Oh, I should also just acknowledge the fact that we have these a wonderful group of advisors at Nature Saskatchewan who are helping us and who will be helping us figure out some questions like how do we identify who should be involved? What are the best ways to involve different groups of rights holders and stakeholders, including First Nations and Métis communities? We also want to thank the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Centre. So I've mentioned Jeff Keith, but also there's a whole team there who've been very engaged, and they're just wonderful in terms of the knowledge that they have. So we really rely on experts and people who know what's going on in a place, and we're really grateful. So thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you, Ciara. Thank you so much. And now we'll pass it over to one of those experts, Michael Rudy, who is the regional coordinator for Saskatchewan and Alberta for Key Biodiversity Area Canada program. He's also at WCS Canada, and he'll take it away with his own presentation. So go ahead and share your screen, Michael, and take it away.
Thanks, Ciara. All right. Can people see my screen?
That's good.
Yep.
Yeah, so as Peter mentioned, I'm the coordinator both for Alberta and Saskatchewan. So you have to excuse me because a few of these species examples are actually Alberta species or even a few BC species as well. But I've tried to sort of illustrate example species for some of these criteria that we're hoping to meet in various places. And then I'll speak more about specific places and a few specific examples from Saskatchewan later. This is basically the main objectives, or my main objectives for the two provinces that I'm tasked with at this time, is to produce a short list of our trigger species that could trigger these KBAs, because we have a massive list of species, and as always, you know, everywhere in Canada we have a lot of, there's data deficiencies everywhere you care to look. So it was a matter of basically filtering down this list to find species that we think we can actually proceed with. We actually have the records and the data is recent enough and so on and so forth. And then from there, identifying these potential sites. And now we're basically in step 3 here, which is basically actually starting to nominate these KBAs in the two provinces. Just here on the right side, this is an example of a trigger species that will trigger in Alberta. This is a moss species that only grows in these very specific habitats in the mountains. And yeah, I have another photo later of it as in its sort of to show you its special habitat. And it'll act as a trigger species in the Rockies in Alberta. So I won't go too much into this because Ciara really already touched on all of this, but yeah, this is basically the flow that we're working with here. And a lot of this process is really relies heavily on expert input. So that's, you know, a major thing that we're looking for help with. These are the 2 criteria. Of the 5 criteria, I'm really focusing on A and B because we don't really have many examples. Lucy's mostly working with the ecological integrity, and then we don't have a lot of examples in my 2 provinces of these other, basically criterion D is not something that I've worked with yet. On the right-hand side, this is a super exciting lichen that I found in BC that I was a very rare lichen species, but it's just so stunning, man. This is, yeah, so these are some examples of criterion A. This is the criterion that depends on threatened biodiversity as opposed to being geographically restricted. So these are sites that may qualify because they support these species that are either essentially critically imperiled or imperiled either nationally or globally. And you can work with these in a variety of, basically depending on the extent of the data, the extent and the quality of the data that you have, you can work with either the number of mature individuals, area of occupancy, or like a proportion of the national or global range that's found at the specific site. So you have to kind of tailor the approach depending on the species you're working with and the extent of the data that you have there. But so these are 2 examples of 2 criterion A triggers. So this is, again, the Porcelain Spring. You can see it just grows in these like seeps in the mountains. So it's like where water has filtered down through rock and is coming straight out of like a limestone face. You get this like permanent sort of faucet or trickle seeping effect. And that is basically the only place that this moss grows. So Canada has something like 50% of the global population, and Alberta has something like 80% of the Canadian population of this species. And one site in Alberta has almost all of that. So this is a very obvious trigger species. And then we also have the kind of leftover from the presentation that it was the template, but this is the Vancouver Island marmot, which is an even more, because this is a IUCN critically imperiled and globally imperiled encosuic species. So that's another really good example. This is an example of a specific trigger in Alberta that will trigger KBAs in Waterton. This is a tiny little alpine columbine species that grows, it's about an inch tall or something, and the whole flower is about as big as the entire plant. So it's just this really heavily adapted toward reproduction, and it grows only in southern Alberta. So all of Canada's population is in one site in Waterton Lake. So that also makes it very easy to exceed the trigger threshold that we need here, which is more than half of the national population of this species. Another one, this is mostly a Saskatchewan example species, actually. This is a Cypress Hills trigger species, so this will definitely enter into the Cypress Hills area, which is another obvious key biodiversity area that immediately jumps out when you look at these records. This is a desert lichen species that grows on these sandy calcareous sandstone outcrops in the Cypress Hills and sort of these dry prairie grasslands. And essentially all of the Canadian population of this species is in the Cypress Hills area, so that will also make it a very easy trigger species there. Both Alberta and Saskatchewan trigger species. This is the swift fox. This is a Kosiewicz species and a globally vulnerable species that was extirpated from Canada in the 30s and has had a pretty successful reintroduction program, but it's still super threatened because all of its habitat in both provinces is very high demand habitat for a variety of activities, and everything from oil and gas exploration to ranching and everything else, and all of these things definitely play into its persistence. So it will also be another trigger species that we rely pretty heavily on, probably in both southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. This is Criterion B. Again, both of these we don't actually have that many in Alberta or Saskatchewan that will play into this, which is why both of these examples here are BC examples. But in general, it's kind of harder to accomplish. It's a little bit less likely. Basically, I think in Saskatchewan, and I have an example of this in the next slide, I think, but most of the Criterion B species that we have are in Saskatchewan, and they're going to be in northern Saskatchewan in the Athabasca Sand Dunes area. There's not a lot of other ones. This is basically, as Ciara explained, this is sites that hold more than 10% of the global or national population size. This is the other thing. Reproductive units are also something that we really need to demonstrate. So, it comes down to the quality of the data that we have, as I mentioned, but we need to demonstrate that the records that we're relying on are recent enough to qualify, which is basically within the last 10 years. But then we also need to demonstrate, or have an expert demonstrate, that there are more than a variable number of reproductive units for all these criteria. But that can also be something that can be, basically we need to confirm that not only is there a population there, that it exceeds these thresholds, but also that it's a reproductive and a viable population. So it's another step, basically another box that needs to be checked so that we can actually confirm that this is true of the places that we're trying to designate KBAs for. And so this is an example of one of those bee triggers in Saskatchewan. This is the tufted hairgrass which is one of basically a whole suite of endemic plant species. Like almost the vast majority of the true endemic plant species in Alberta or Saskatchewan are actually in Saskatchewan, which is kind of interesting. I guess, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily assume that was true, but yeah, the Athabasca Sand Dunes are definitely a very special place. So Criterion B will definitely come into play there. Because we need to demonstrate that there's more than 1% of the global population, and in this case, this is an endemic species, so that's pretty clear. And then I kind of wanted to take a slightly different direction, because as I've been, teaching myself this or learning this, how to actually apply these criteria and actually designate sites, it's been kind of interesting to see how high the bar is and how often I run into species that I think should have met these thresholds or should be important enough, or areas that should be, but the focus really is on globally or nationally rare species. So I kind of wanted to look at a specific case study, the Crayon Crevices in Saskatchewan, which probably won't meet the thresholds to be a KBA, just to kind of show an example of almost like the limitations or the specificity of this process. So some examples of that are, sites with very high numbers of only provincially rare species that are not globally or nationally, critically imperiled or vulnerable. And poorly surveyed species, or species that are really require very specialized identification. We're unlikely to have either the extent of the data to meet those thresholds, or if we do, very often what we run into is that there's one very specialized person who has worked with this species, and the data are no longer recent enough to qualify. So because they're just so hard to work with, there are just a smaller number of experts who who are actually experienced enough and knowledgeable enough to actually work with the species and identify it. So they're more likely to not be captured by this process as well. So this is the Crayon Crevices, which is an important plant area in Saskatchewan. A lot of people, I think, aren't really familiar with it and don't really realize what an interesting site it is, because limestone bedrock in general in Saskatchewan is really rare, and the site has these really striking, about 5 meter deep limestone crevices that provide basically this exceptionally high level of microsite variability. Basically every tiny little microsite that you can imagine in terms of light exposure and humidity and snow depth and everything else and wind exposure, like everything is in there somewhere. So this site has some of Saskatchewan's most concentrated rare species diversity in terms of species per hectare, but there's only one actual national KBA trigger species, and it's not likely to qualify as a KBA at this time because we need to demonstrate that more than 20% of the national population is at this site, which is not likely because it's sort of a disjunct population of a mountain species that's basically much more at home in the Rocky Mountains and the Cypress Hills. So, for example, this is
Michael,
it. This is the.
Sorry, just a heads up. Just a heads up. We're running up on the time pretty soon.
Okay. Did I not have 15 minutes?
10. Sorry.
10. Oh, sorry. I thought it was 15. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just skip through. This is a map of the anticipated. This is sort of more recent than the map that Ciara showed. This is basically the KBAs that I'm hoping to actually proceed with this year that are not stemming from important bird areas for the most part. So these are KBAs starting de novo, basically, that aren't being modified from important bird areas. Yeah, this is basically the meat of the slide, or I guess what we're really asking for is these are the areas that we're really looking for or appreciate input. So ideas for other KBAs that we haven't thought of, or species experts that we can reach out to, and then stakeholders and rights holders and Indigenous contacts for the sites of interest, for the sites that we've already identified or are proceeding with, essentially. So I think that's, yeah, I just had some more cool plants, but get to that later, I guess. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I ran out of time there, but.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Sorry for the time. I wish we could talk about this more, and in the questions, I'm sure we'll have much more time to go over things there.
Thanks.
To keep it moving forward, our next speaker is Dr. Lucy Poley, who is also at WCS Canada, Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. She is the Key Biodiversity Area Ecosystem Criteria Coordinator. And so she'll be talking about the work on ecosystem KBAs within Saskatchewan. Lucy, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I'll try to go quickly here. Yeah, so one of the great things about the KBA program is that it takes into account the fact that species individually are not the only important elements of biodiversity. So ecosystems as a whole are also potentially delineated as KBAs under the criteria. In order to do that, of course, you need a consistent definition of what an ecosystem or an ecosystem type is. So according to the KBA Global Standard, we're looking for a defined ecosystem unit for standard and repeatable assessment. And this needs to be classified at an intermediate level in a globally consistent ecosystem classification hierarchy. So it can be compared to ecosystems globally. In general, an ecosystem is defined by variables related to the characteristic native species and biotic elements, the abiotic environment in which they live, and then the interactions between and within these factors within the ecosystem. So there are 3 specific criteria designed to cover ecosystems in the KBA standard. The first is Criterion A2, which is threatened ecosystem types. So according to this, A2 KBAs hold a significant proportion of the global, or national for national KBAs, extent of a threatened ecosystem. And these must be assessed globally as critically endangered, or vulnerable under the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, which is similar to the Red List of Species in looking at levels of endangerment. So in order to qualify as a, can you go back one? As I think it's A2 site, It needs to hold one or more of the following: either 5% of the global or national extent of a globally critically endangered or endangered ecosystem type, or at least 10% of the global or national extent of a vulnerable ecosystem type. The next one is Criterion B4, which is geographically restricted ecosystem types. So B4 KBAs hold a significant proportion of the global or national extent of a geographically restricted ecosystem. And these don't have to be assessed as threatened or vulnerable under the red list of ecosystems, but the site does need to hold a larger proportion of that ecosystem type. So at least 20% of the global or national extent of an ecosystem type is needed to qualify a region as a B4 KBA. The third one is Criterion C, which is a little bit different. So this is looking for areas of high ecological integrity. Criterion C sites should hold wholly intact ecological communities with their supporting large-scale ecological processes. So we're looking for both biotic integrity in terms of species composition, the abundance, interactions, and ecological function, as well as very low levels of direct industrial human impact. Criterion C sites are delineated within ecoregions, and we're looking for 2 or less per ecoregion, so we don't want everything. They're also designed to be quite large compared to many of our other KBAs. So these are our big KBAs, at least 10,000 kilometers squared in size, within the confines of potentially managing the region as a unit. So I'll show you a little bit about the progress of these 3 criteria in Saskatchewan. So you're lucky in Saskatchewan because this is actually one of the regions where we've made the most progress in the criteria A2 and B4. Which is awesome. So I should have mentioned on this slide that this scoping analysis was undertaken by Pat Comer, who works for NatureServe in the USA. He is a ecosystem classification and red listing whiz and did this analysis last year. So we were looking for vulnerable, critically endangered or endangered ecosystem types in the prairies. These came out to be 2 different ecosystem types in Saskatchewan. The reddish orangey blobs are made up of Northern Great Plains fescue mixed grass prairie ecosystem type. This has been classified under the red list as an endangered ecosystem. So in order to be at least 5% of the global distribution of this ecosystem type, these sites have to hold at least about 1,000 kilometers squared of this ecosystem. Then we also have 7 potential KBAs that weren't quite enough area to be national or global KBAs, but they do qualify as national KBAs under our national standard. And those are in the ecosystem type Northern Great Plains dry mixed grass prairie. So those are the bluey greeny blobs there. This again is an endangered ecosystem type, but there's a bit more of it in the US. So it's a little bit more extensive than the fescue mixed grass prairie. So in order to cover at least 5% of the national distribution, these blobs contain at least about 1,900 kilometers squared of this ecosystem type. So as several people have already mentioned, expert input is a really big part of the KBA process. So what we're looking for next is to confirm the actual distribution and condition of ecosystems at these sites and within these sites using local expert knowledge. So if you're someone who has local expert knowledge of any of these regions and the ecosystems within them, please feel free to email me and I'll put my email again in the chat. And we are hoping to hold some expert sessions soon to discuss this. Then in terms of Criterion C in Saskatchewan, most of the really intact areas in Saskatchewan are up north. As you probably know, there's a lot of human industrial activity in southern Saskatchewan. So what we did is a scoping analysis across the country that basically eliminated regions of Canada that won't qualify for Criterion C based on the degree of human pressure present. So we used human footprints containing roads and agriculture and railways and things like that. We also looked at deforested areas, and we looked at the river connectivity and watersheds due to human activity. So that resulted in our initial regions for Criterion C of about 10,000 kilometers squared or larger, of low levels of human pressure. So you can see in the map, these fell in 2 ecoregions in Saskatchewan. There's a chunk in the Brown and the Midwest Canadian Shield forests, and then some of the Northern Canadian Shield taiga right up north. That's shared with several other provinces and territories. So my next steps for Criterion C is to, again, seek out regional relevant knowledge and data from local experts, to determine within these potential areas where would the 10,000 kilometer squared sites actually fall. And I want to focus on confirming that the human pressures that we said were present or absent are actually present or absent. We didn't miss anything or overlook anything. And then even more importantly is the next step of evaluating the biotic integrity of these ecosystems and the ecosystem function. Are they large enough to allow large fires to move through, for example, which is really important in the boreal forest. And just look for the places that would most support the full complement of species ecosystem functions in these regions. So this work, again, also ongoing and always looking for expert input. So I'll drop my email in a chat. And if you have any questions, you can also put them in there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Great. Thank you so much. Just a note to everybody, we'll still have about 10, maybe 15 minutes of questions at the end, before the end of the hour. And we will be staying for a half hour after the hour, so until 11:30 Central Time, to keep answering questions. So I do encourage you to stick around for that if you'd like. But we'll turn it over to our last speaker, last but certainly not least, Peter Kingsmill, who might be known to a lot of you in the audience already. He's a recipient of the Governor General's Conservation Award for Canada and the founder of the Redbury Lake UNESCO Biosphere Reserve Region, in Saskatchewan. He's also an author and serves as the publications editor for the Alberta Society of Professional Biologists. Peter, take it away.
Thanks very much, Peter. Yeah, so greetings and good morning from Treaty 6 territory. And thank you, Joe Schmutz and Peter, for inviting me this morning. And thank you, Ciara and Michael and Lucy, for your presentations, which I found fascinating. Lots to learn. I have to say I've grown to admire this whole new webinar thing, virtual meetings where we save gasoline, travel time, and maybe even aviation fuel. But I do kind of miss the handshakes and hugs. And of course, there's no beer. But let's get on with it. What I have to say is perhaps more about landscape integrity than species or even ecosystems at risk, although they exist as well. So in light of the fact that there is this kind of new kid on the block, in Canada at least, we are witnessing the birth of this newish idea called a KBA. And I have been asked to bring to this webinar a bit of perspective, I suppose. The Redbury Lake story as it pertains to the transition some 20 years ago from an earlier designation as an important bird area, which was located at a migratory bird sanctuary, that's federal jurisdiction, of course, to its additional designation by UNESCO as a biosphere reserve. Change is seldom simple, so this will require doing a little damage to that hopeful looking little egg on this slide. Peter, could you prepare that egg for me? Thank you. There we go. Biosphere reserves have always had a particular and maybe peculiar, but certainly common geometry. UNESCO geometry incorporates a core area, a yoke, if you will, which has been accorded a national level of protection. Here at Redbury, that's a migratory bird sanctuary. The core area, in turn, is surrounded by a buffer zone, a level of provincial protection, which in our case is a provincially mandated municipal zoning, and that would make the white of the egg. Surrounded in turn by what is commonly referred to as a zone of transition, where human beings can go about their nefarious daily activities without limit, but at least mindful, hopefully, of the conservation mandate of the core and the limitations of the buffer zone. So hence the fried egg analogy. And after all, the frying pan defines a watershed pretty well, you have to admit. And yes, this slide appears oversimplified, but in fact, it was a simple line drawing of an egg in a frying pan on a whiteboard that was the trigger for the designation process for Redbury Lake Biosphere Reserve. The frying pan, of course, outlines the closed watershed of Redbury Lake, complete with its farms and smaller lakes and villages. The white of the egg is the buffer zone, and the egg is the yellow part of the core is that egg yolk in the middle. This whiteboard drawing of a classic biosphere reserve was presented to a meeting of the what I call the original 6 biosphere reserves in Canada, held at Long Point, Ontario in 1998, where it caught the imagination of folks around the table, which was lucky because also at that time, the Prime Minister of Canada had on his mind the designation of what he wanted to be Canada's perfect and final and richly endowed biosphere reserve at Tofino on Canada's west coast, or on Vancouver Island's west coast. As it turned out, the PM notwithstanding, we at Redbury received the enthusiastic cooperation and support of the science community involved with the UNESCO network. And 2 years later, and apparently to the Prime Minister's everlasting chagrin, Redbury Lake and Clayoquot Sound biosphere reserves received their designations from UNESCO together in the winter of 2000. You need to know, on behalf of the denizens of this UNESCO site at Redbury, I am personally indebted to our friend and neighbor, Dr. Joe Schmutz, who I believe is in our audience today, for working with us to incorporate the whole of Redbury Lake watershed into the IBA, thereby providing essential data and much needed focus to our application for Biosphere Reserve designation. I also want to express our gratitude to the late Dr. Fred Roots for his leadership and support at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO in Ottawa. So Peter, could you change the slide, please? This gives you a sense of the boundaries of the original IBA. So the red line kind of around the outside of the lake, which also represents approximately the buffer zone that was legislated as a zoning area. And then the other map that we have, please. There we go. So there is the watershed of Redbury Lake, which is the whole of the Biosphere Reserve at the present. And you can see the pink is the lake, oddly, and the brown around it is the zoning area. So that is one way of protecting an ecosystem. It's certainly in the minds of UNESCO. So let's fast forward 21 years since the turn of the millennium, and really you will hardly recognize the original Biosphere Reserve these days. The core protected area remains. It's still a fairly peaceful migratory bird sanctuary. The buffer zone remains intact, but it's no longer pristine, and I would say that its continued integrity is in jeopardy. And the IBA itself has remained intact, although a couple of federally protected national wildlife areas in the northern part of the zone of transition are actually in serious jeopardy as a result of changing federal priorities. Pay attention to some of the things that change out there whenever you try to do something or other. In one case there, we have a local pressure to change the zoning. Another case, we have the federal government just getting bored with taking care of a chunk of ground in the northern part of what people refer to as the bush. Anyway, there are all kinds of ways to ruin something. The Biosphere Reserve Board and management are currently working assiduously to bring together surrounding rural municipalities and bring them into that larger area. And we have been working through, our executive director's been working with Mr. Wasis-Nayak to fully recognize Redbury Lake as part of that First Nations traditional territory and to establish a number of OECMs within an expanded Biosphere Reserve footprint. I'm sure most of you know what an OECM is, but I shall tell you what it is. It's an other effective area-based conservation method. So it's another new kid on the block, I guess. Anyway, you also won't recognize the Canadian network of UNESCO Biosphere Reserves because Biosphere Reserves are now called, more properly maybe, Biosphere Regions. And far from the original 6 back in the last century, that's about 24 years ago, there are now 19 shiny, approved, designated, polished, and official biosphere regions in Canada. So much for Prime Minister Chrétien's dream that there would be only 7. And still, almost nobody in Canada has a clue what a biosphere reserve is, but apparently everybody wants to have one. I suppose people think it's like scoring a low-budget UNESCO World Heritage Site so they can build hotels and get rich from tourism. At this point, I acknowledge a certain cynicism may cloud my viewpoint, but 30 years of being involved with a number of apparently promising efforts to promote sustainable development, initiatives like ecotourism, organic agriculture, and even sustainable forestry, have convinced me that sustainable development is at best a myth told to deceive and calm the public, and at worst an outright lie to support unmitigated growth. So it won't surprise you perhaps when I suggest that the continuing success of any conservation initiative at all may fundamentally be reliant on understanding the science of human behavior, not on the fun science stuff like habitat loss and species at risk. This last and next part of my presentation might sound a bit negative to the idea of KBAs, but it is not intended to be. Every effort in the right direction beats the hell out of dawdling along and not making an effort. So back to the science of human behavior. It ain't always pretty. Does anybody here watch the TV series Yellowstone? I love that show. It provides a rather brutal weekly assessment of who we really are, not just as North Americans, but as humanity. The writing is marvelous, and a couple of weeks ago we heard this gem about biodiversity. It was a rant by the show's principal cowboy character talking to a semi-clad vegan protester on a sidewalk, and I quote, "You ever plow a field to plant quinoa or sorghum or whatever the hell it is that you eat? You kill everything on the ground or under it. You kill every snake, every frog, every mouse, every vole, mole, worm, quail, you kill them all. So I guess the only real question is, how cute does an animal have to be before you care if it dies to feed you?" And that is the challenge for all of us who really care and really believe and every day consider we're on the right path to save our world. We need to move from pretty to possible. We may feel like we have matured past the keystone species approach to conservation, but have we? Our focus may have progressed from tigers, elephants, and caribou to moles, voles, and bees, but how about some deeper issues which we need to grapple with? Things like the geography of functional biodiversity and the importance of connectedness. Meaningful connectedness is a massive issue here on the prairies, of course, where unfortunately connectedness is all about bulldozers widening public roadsides to support the passage of ever bigger farm machinery from one field to the next. And that is just a way of thinking that we are just we just live with it here. Sorry. I need another slide. Could you please, Peter? Thank you. Changing landscapes. I came across an article published by the Yellowstone to Yukon region, a group of really forward-thinking biologists and supporters out there. It stretches from Wyoming to Yukon's border with Alaska. The article, like the region, is extensive, but its title says it all. Can a large landscape conservation vision contribute to achieving biodiversity targets? I can assure you that those folks out there are pretty focused on the importance of connectedness. And you can see the expanse of that place, and you can see the little protected areas that are spotted along throughout. I recently corresponded with an Alberta biologist, one who is particularly knowledgeable about framing biodiversity, but he's not involved particularly with the Y2Y initiative. He has this to say on the subject. Humans like to classify things, and indeed have a hard time making sense of the world if they don't classify what they see and what they experience into discrete boxes. Politicians and land managers especially, they like tidy stories. So if you want politicians and land managers to care about something, you go out of your way to frame it tidily. KBAs are another way to think about things, but just like ecosystems, which used to be considered tidy in their own right, it's not like you can fly a mission accomplished banner just because you protected this or that KBA. It's still mapping a discretized perspective onto a world that is anything but. And then there's several matters of money and ownership. A couple of weeks ago, a sport commentator on talk radio observed, something is worth what someone is willing to pay. We can go ahead and write that off as a tasteless and trite truism from a questionable source, but it is nonetheless an accurate expression of how society assigns value. A biologist friend with over 3 decades of frontline conservation experience had this to say: if you don't own it, you can't be sure you can protect it. Labeling does little to protect a site unless everyone, including the bulldozer operator, buys in. So here we are. Key biodiversity areas. Do they offer a way forward? If we listen to the truth seekers, be they biologists or land managers or crafters of policy, and if we learn enough history to help us avoid repeating mistakes and perhaps even shine a light onto things to do differently in the future, then that may give us all the hope we are allowed to have today. A Lutheran cantor in Ontario shared this last week. Nature exists in the spaces between people and in the relationships that we have with one another. That cantor, Julia Kedra was her name, actually wrote that God exists in those spaces, but I like to think that nature might be part of that. So I'll leave you with the last slide that Peter's just put up. Thank you for listening. Thanks for the invitation to be with you, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Peter. It was a wonderful, wonderful way to bookend this webinar and series of presentations. Thank you, Ciara. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Michael, for a terrific round of talks today. I'm going to end the screen share, and I'm going to allow everybody in the audience to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras if they like. You don't have to, but feel free to do so if you'd wish. And we'll jump into the questions. We have about 8 minutes of questions before the end of the hour, but then we will be continuing for 30 minutes after that as well. So stick around for as long as you want and as long as you're able. And we'll start off with a question that was put in the chat near the beginning. Feel free to raise your hand with the function on Microsoft Teams if you'd like to ask your question yourself. But let me start off with this first question for the group. For the criteria required specific quantitative thresholds, how can you account for data uncertainties? You mentioned about population in the assessment. Is that observed population or modeled population? So I think Ciara or Michael, if you'd like to maybe take a first stab at that. About uncertainty, accounting for uncertainty within the quantitative thresholds.
So I can answer a little bit, but maybe Michael could answer if he's come across some particular examples from Saskatchewan. So yes, absolutely. We have a lot of, I think Michael mentioned this quite a few times, and it's very, very true that there are a lot of data limitations associated with this kind of work, and mostly because there hasn't been enough surveying of many species, especially rare species in Canada. And so where there isn't sufficient data, we actually often cannot proceed with the work of identifying a key biodiversity area. And we're capturing that information and making sure that we track what are the species that should lead and ecosystems that should lead to a KBA, but we don't have sufficient information for that. So that then that list of species can feed into additional survey work in the future, potentially modeling work. There, you are allowed to do some modeling work and sort of to figure out habitat suitability models, figure out where the species are likely to be, but you can't end it there. As Michael mentioned, there's also a reproductive unit threshold that has to be met. So you need observations of the species within the last, I think it's 10 to 12 years, although there's some a leeway there if you have extremely rare species that are understudied, and if experts think that the populations are likely not to have changed, you could make use of slightly older data. But basically, it's kind of case by case. We're looking for the best available data, be that modeled or observed, but you absolutely need those observations at the site for it to qualify as a key biodiversity area. Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I would agree. This process can never replace a lack of data. So if you don't have the data, then all you can do is flag the species and pass it on to people who may be able to, you know, incorporate it into surveys later on and so on. But yeah, I would agree. I think that's the best thing you can do, and that's what we've been doing, is just flagging them in cases where we run into things that we have every expectation do exist in an area, but we just don't have enough data, and we can't reach out to an expert who can speak to it being still extant at a site, or there being sufficient reproductive units. Then at a certain point, there's nothing you can't move forward other than flagging it for future surveys.
Yeah, thank you both. Next question in the chat, and again, feel free to raise your hand or even just speak up if you'd like to ask a question yourself. Could the bird atlas details plus leopard frog data be used to assist in classifying all remaining native prairie grassland as a KBA in Saskatchewan? I guess I'll let people think about that question for a little bit and just mention that we are doing this work in collaboration as well with Birds Canada and NatureServe Canada. And so Birds Canada in particular has the historic IBAs, important bird and biodiversity areas, that are in the process of being reassessed as key biodiversity areas. I think Amanda Beichel from Birds Canada is on the chat as well, if you want to speak up and speak to that as well. But let me first turn it over to our presenters and see if anybody wants to take a stab at answering that question.
I would just like to jump in for 1 second to say thanks for coming, Ross. It's great to see you here. So I think that question came before Lucy started presenting the ecosystem criteria work, and you'll see how effective the ecosystem criteria work may be to capture some large areas of grasslands that are highly, highly threatened. But of course, there are limitations to the approach as well, just because of, you know, what's the size of the site that needs to be captured for it to qualify as a key biodiversity area. But I think you've had some follow-up questions, and Lucy's provided some answers there. But really, like, the amazing thing about you know, being able to look at both ecosystems and species is that we're trying to do a full sort of scope of what are the possible elements, be they ecosystems, species, that could lead to a key biodiversity area. And as Michael says, some things are going to fall between the cracks. I think one thing that we have to be very aware of is that this is one tool, and it's one tool that decision makers happen to find very robust and credible. And so there's a lot of trust in this, and people are already asking for the results to feed into decision-making processes and planning processes. But it is insufficient in and of itself, and this ties into what Peter was talking about too, to take care of our environment all around us and be able to, you know, do the activities that we need to do, but also in the ways that still make sure that the impacts are reduced on nature, and that we have as minimal an impact on the ecosystems as possible. So we do need other tools too. Key biodiversity areas should be used in conjunction with information about, you know, watersheds, hydrology, where's like, how do we protect our water, biocultural values. So what are the values on the landscape that may not be, you know, related to a species, but things that we care deeply about and that are culturally important. Ecosystem services, where do we depend on nature and ecosystems for different things that we need? So this key biodiversity areas are something that captures biodiversity that aren't being captured by other tools, but they're not sufficient in and of themselves either. So I just wanted to quickly lay that out there too. I'm sure there's other people who can respond to this question as well.
Thank you, Ciara. Michael, Lucy, Peter, any follow-ups to that?
I think that puts it pretty well. Yeah, this is, each specific criterion is one tool in and of itself. So we can use the ecosystem criteria to get at those larger chunks of remaining threatened ecosystems or rare ecosystems, we can use the species tools or species criteria to fill in some of the smaller gaps. But as Ciara said, we obviously like KBAs, we're here working on them, but they are only one tool for conservation. And certainly I think the more conservation methods and approaches, the better. So yeah, I'm here and I'm out in Calgary, so I'm close to ish to you Saskatchewan folks, and I certainly see the value of trying to protect as much native prairie as we can. So we will use these tools as much as we can, and hopefully at the same time other conservation approaches are ongoing, and we'll try and do our best to take into account as much of the native biodiversity out there as we can by combining the criteria.
Yeah, I don't really have much else to add that Ciara and Lucy haven't already added, but excellent points.
Yeah, I would just like to thank Ciara for the breadth of consideration that you gave to a number of issues. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Lauren, I see your hand's up. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question?
First of all, Peter, thank you very much for your presentation. It's been a long time since we've met, and but really you gave a very good critique on what's involved in protecting an area. And I've often maintained that once we have secured an area, we're going to spend the rest of our lives retaining that protection. And so you're certainly right on. I guess being older and maybe not many years to go, I feel that we are not moving quick enough and aggressive enough. In southern Saskatchewan, we've lost at least 90% of our natural landscape. So the idea of ever preserving 25% or 30, I mean, we'll be lucky to get 10 or 12. And the province has sold off over 1 million acres of public lands in the last 10 years in southern Saskatchewan. And we just had a Zoom meeting yesterday about that. And everybody recognizes that this shouldn't be happening, that we got to retain the bit of public land that we do still have, because 85% of southern Saskatchewan is privately owned, although urban people accept zoning regulations. We're still in the Wild West out in the rural areas, where if I want to drain a slough or bulldoze a bush, as Peter pointed out, it's fair game. So we've got a lot of way to go, and we've left a real mess for you younger people to try to salvage something from what remains. And I don't have the answer. It's frustrating, and there's the odd glimmer of hope, like Peter's biological reserve there, and but there's a long way to go. So I don't have easy answers, but thank you folks for coming on, and we will do what we can to help you out. And Peter, we need your good wisdom as well.
You're very gracious, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for your ongoing support. And just so, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the discussion that's being had, and that's a discussion that will continue to be had within Saskatchewan. And I think probably there's lots of support from outside of Saskatchewan too. And one of the things that we have to be very careful of working on the Key Biodiversity Area program is that it is kind of a little bit at arm's length from any sort of management discussions or what will be done with the areas on the land. It's important that sort of everyone recognizes that the Key Biodiversity Area work that's going on, that Michael is leading in Saskatchewan, is very much agnostic of what will be done with the information afterwards. It's really just a scientific process that makes use of the best available data. And we have input from, government scientists, NGO scientists, academic scientists, non-scientist knowledge holders, to make sure that the product and the outputs are the most high quality products that everyone will trust. And we hope that they'll feed into all sorts of wonderful discussions about, well, there is some really remarkable biodiversity on the landscape, you know, everywhere, and there's very little that remains. And we hope to draw attention to these places so that there will be more both international attention, national attention, and provincial attention on these places. Beyond that, then it goes back into the hands of people fighting for what they believe in, I suppose. We think that also, you know, we hope that it can feed into very wise land use planning too. I'll leave it at that because it really is, I'm not an expert on Saskatchewan land, but I just wanted to make that sort of point.
Thank you, Ciara, for following up on that. I'll note as well, so Ross earlier asked about seeing a larger copy of the map of KBAs in progress. And so there are two places you can see the KBAs that are currently identified across Canada. One is on the KBA Canada website. You can see everywhere that's in progress, the KBAs that have gone through all the stages of review, and also the KBAs that we're working on at the moment. And at the IBA Canada website, you can see all the existing bird and biodiversity areas that are in the process of being reassessed into the KBA criteria. So check out those links in the chat. I'm not seeing any other questions. Maybe, oh, one more here. Michael Fitzsimmons. N ranks are based on arbitrary political boundaries. What mechanism prevents KBA designation and therefore potential waste of conservation resources on species that are geographically restricted in Canada, but extremely common across much of the US? Would we have an entirely different set of species that are geographically restricted in Canada if the border was at the 48th or 50th parallel instead of the 49th?
I think that we are sympathetic to this idea, but I think that for the most part, we won't be identifying species that are extremely common across North America. There are some cases where plants that are very rare in Canada are very common across the US. Whether those are a huge focus or not, I think the answer is no. For the most part now, we have enough experience. We've been working in other provinces over the past 2 years, only recently starting in Saskatchewan and Alberta. But we have enough experience that we're seeing that it really is species and ecosystems that are actually quite threatened, and there's enough of those that are the focus of our work, as well as geographically restricted species that are endemics. So we're not, you know, going after, I mean, if they qualify as a key biodiversity area and they're a weed across North America, but they still qualify within Canada, that is a possibility. But it is it's so far it actually has not happened. We have 250 key biodiversity areas identified. Most of the sites that have been identified for geographically restricted species are things like rare Beringian plants that don't occur anywhere else in the world. Some of the species are along the border that we've identified that are geographically restricted are quite rare slugs, really funny little slugs, and things like that. But we have not so far. Out of the 250, I don't think there's a single one that would be considered a common weedy plant in North America. But the theoretical potential is there, Michael, and we'd be happy to continue to discuss that. It might be worthwhile having a phone call, perhaps with Michael and myself and other people in our team, just to sort of explore, is that going to happen? And perhaps that might be helpful.
I would also add, Ciara, that it's probably unlikely that we would end up designating a KBA strictly for one of those species. They may enter into as a secondary trigger into other, like for example, in Waterton, there are probably going to be a few species that are significantly more common south of the border. But I know at least as far as the KBAs that I've been starting to work on, I am making a conscious focus to try to incorporate as many species as I can into each area, because I feel that it makes them more rigorous and sort of more defensible. And that would definitely help to sort of average out some of that effect as well. If there's one or two species that are more common south of the border, or just based on, or their status rank is disproportionately has to do with where exactly the border falls. So.
Thank you both for answering that. couple of hands up. Let's go ahead with. I didn't see who put their hand up first there. I think it was Nick. If you want to go ahead.
Thank you very much. Great talk. I'm going to have to do some reading so I don't just bore you with a bunch of random questions. But the question I wanted to ask was about how species trigger in relation to recent land use changes. So, for example, I've watched swift foxes quite regularly down here in the Val-Marie area, but I've seen their land get plowed under. They've moved to other sites sometimes. Sometimes they've been replaced by red foxes. I mean, relative to this point, it's not really germane. But what I wanted to know was what happens when, for example, all the land breaking that happened from the PF lands. What happens to that designation if the land's been broken? It's essentially no longer relevant in some of these situations, but it would still have recent data that would probably be relevant to the surrounding land that is yet to be broken, but is at risk of being broken. How do you treat those types of situations? And are triggers still caused by 3-year-old data, but the land's now completely changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that really comes down to having the best experts weigh in on the sites and having the best knowledge of what's happening at that site. We can't guarantee that a mistake wouldn't be made, but we have one safeguard in place for that. So, well, we have a couple, but first, when the sites are being identified, it's really important to talk to people who know that area. And often the species experts and the ecosystem experts know the area, but if they don't, then we need to talk to people who know what's going on in the place. And then there's the opportunity again to review that. So, and we try to review it as broadly as possible. Often that takes over a year to review these sites because we're really making an effort to reach out to people who aren't just ecology experts, but also landscape managers and NGOs working in the area. But then finally, it's recommended that the sites are reassessed every 10 to 12 years. And this takes into account, this helps because we can only identify sites based on the best available knowledge today. We're not trying to do it based on what might happen in the future. And there's so many changes that are likely to happen in the future. We hope that they're for the better, but often with the rate of global change occurring right now, including climate change, species are going to be moving, sites are going to be changing. And we do anticipate that sites will sometimes blink off or maybe need to be adjusted in terms of their location. And so that could be caught, as a last measure after, if a site is reassessed, and it can be reassessed earlier than that if clearly, it's brought to our attention that these sites are no longer valid. We are trying to, so Birds Canada is developing a KBA registry where it's just a wonderful interactive site where you can download data, view maps, view associated data with each of the key biodiversity areas, and all of that will be publicly accessible. We're hoping to eventually work in some tools where people can flag problems with the data, flag changes in the key biodiversity area, and add monitoring data, attach it to sort of iNaturalist projects so the public can monitor data. We're hoping to develop a whole sort of, lots of tools where caretakers that can help support caretakers to look at these sites and flag any changes in them. So those are a few of the ways that we might catch that issue, but mostly we hope to catch it at the beginning through talking to experts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ciara. I think Joe had your hand up next, but before I go over, Lauren, is your hand still up from the previous question, or did you have another question? Perfect, thank you. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. I think this has been a fascinating series of presentations that are, I think, very well rounded. Or I should say, I'm sitting in Treaty 6 territory, an hour south of Peter and 3 hours northwest of Lauren. Anyway, I also want to thank Peter for being so ready to present to us today. And I think he did not share as much about the work and the the reasons we have to thank Peter for the accomplishments in the Red Prairie Lake area. Peter has been participating and helping from the very beginning, and there is his own commitment, but I think his strength was to work with people around them and inspire them and cajole them, and I think there was a lot of that. And I think this is where we need to work on the intersection between where people are and where nature is, as Peter pointed out. And I'm very glad to always watch Ciara, and it's nice to see that she leaves the door open to that broadening perspective. I think KBA, I think Peter said the nice and tidy packages, they are necessary but not sufficient, and I think they will be very useful. I think they'll be very useful as sort of a cornerstone. Some people need packages, and then we expand from there. So it'll be a very useful cornerstone to help us at Nature Saskatchewan and around the province to work on that intersection between people and nature. And as far as the question goes, let me just fast forward a long ways ahead. How long can we expect to have the help of Michael, for instance? Can you give us a sense? And once the delineation is nearing its end, that's when we think a lot of our work really starts. And what sort of collaboration do you envision along that line? And something about nuts and bolts, all the good work that is being done, where will that be? Where will we be able to find that in 20 years, in 30 years? Is there an archiving process, or will it be in an office in Ottawa or in Toronto, and then it gets cleaned out and it disappears? And on that thing, actually, I'm starting to wonder whatever happened to all the conservation plans that we wrote in the IBA program. Are they still somewhere within reach? I think the library people in the universities are very cognizant of the importance of archiving, and so that might be something. It's not that we have enough to do, all of us, but that might be something worth consider in the future as well. So thanks again, everyone. I really enjoyed listening today. It was a fascinating, well-rounded series of perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks for your support up until now and hopefully into the future. I can answer a couple of those questions, although those are a lot of difficult questions there. So we are very mindful, and I think maybe if Amanda's on the call from Birds Canada, oh, okay, wait, so she's answering there. She says, a small part of your great question, there are conservation plans stored on the IBA Canada website, and the link, she's put the link into the chat. But we're very mindful. We have more technology now and ability to make sure that data is available and stored in a really robust manner than Birds Canada did 20 years ago. And so we actually have a whole team across WCS Canada, Birds Canada, NatureServe Canada that is developing this wonderful registry where you know, all the information associated with each key biodiversity area will be stored, and then all the ancillary data and additional information and knowledge and species tables and additional maps will all be easily accessible as well. Though this will be launched in the spring. It's taken a while to develop, but it's very impressive. It's a beautiful thing. And as I mentioned before, we hope to add all sorts of tools that will help people on the land, caretakers, to organize around key biodiversity areas, organize stewardship, store information about species and the landscape and changes, etc. So that's all coming, and we will keep you up to date. So anyone who's interested in following along with the progress, we release a newsletter that sort of just lays out our progress on a monthly basis. We also have monthly webinars that talks about different aspects of the program, including on, you know, Indigenous knowledge in key biodiversity areas, or the technical aspects, or, you know, even the infrastructure. We'll talk about that as well. I noticed another question in the chat, which was about where does the funding come from, and that's related a little bit to how long can we have Michael here with us. We would like to keep him for as long as we possibly can. he's very impressive as a botanist and as a biologist. We're thrilled to have him on. He worked at the Conservation Data Center in Saskatchewan, although he's based now in Alberta, and has just this fantastic knowledge. He does all their work as well, so he'll be out for the summer doing field work and discovering alvars in Alberta, hopefully. But after that field work is over, we hope to have him back working on key biodiversity areas until that work is done. One of the things about this work is that it's so specific and so detail oriented, and there's so many criteria and guidelines that anyone who becomes an expert in this becomes hugely valuable, both within Canada and then even at the global scale. There aren't that many people with that expertise, and everyone in the world is now trying to identify these key biodiversity areas. So that's to say that we hope to have them for a while. I'd say this project will be going at the national scale for another 3 to 4 years, but there will be some maintenance, including sort of the registry and some capacity support. So we believe that we'll identify the bulk of key biodiversity areas in Canada over the next sort of maybe let's say 3 to 5 years. But then after that, there will be more to identify because data will become better, new species will be noticed. And so at that point, we want to be able to support other organizations, institutions, experts to identify individual key biodiversity areas. We'll provide the support, but it'll be a much smaller kind of project and infrastructure. But the conversations now about the sustainability of this initiative, we're talking very long term, but it will be more of a maintenance sort of period after the next 3 to 5 years. Most of the funding from this comes from fundraising from foundations. WCS Canada, at the beginning, there was seed funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada for the first year. But we've been going for 3 years now. So for the last 2 years, the bulk of our funding has come from individual foundations. I'd say about 30 different ones. We do a lot of different fundraising. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, the funding comes from the Palmer Foundation, Chalkers Foundation, and Alberta EcoTrust. And we have some additional core funding that we've added to that from the Koval Foundation, a couple of other foundations. And so we're putting this together and keeping it going. And we're in discussions with government to be able to have some core funding again for the next several years to make sure that it goes on. But it's popular enough and people really do believe in it that so far we haven't had any problems, but we've had to kind of build it block by block, province by province, and territory by territory. I think I answered some of those questions. I may not have hit them all. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has via email as well.
Thank you, Ciara and Joe. Joe for that great question, and Ciara for the excellent answer. We've got about 8 minutes left until we hit the hard end of the webinar. So keep the questions coming. There's a couple more in the chat here, starting with what is the process to leverage more complete survey data outside of the existing boundaries?
I'm not sure we have a great answer for that. So I've described what we hope to have in the future in terms of making it public what data we're missing and for what species we don't have data for. As we have had, even the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center has been proactive in trying to find out, well, what are the trigger species in places like Cypress Hills that we could do survey work on in the summer. So the more we build partnerships with different organizations that do survey work, the more we're able to feed information saying, well, if we had data for this particular species, we'd be able to identify a key biodiversity area. I don't know if anyone else has any additional answers to that, but we hope to continue to build that.
Yeah, I'll add on. I think one of in the coming year, especially as we get a better idea of where these areas are, and we start, concentrating more on outreach and engagement with naturalist communities across the province. There's a lot of great opportunities as well for community bioblitzes and community surveys as well, and so working with other organizations and feeding them data on where these KBAs are, where they could be, where the data gaps are is, like Ciara said, I think the main route there.
And one last thing is that if there is interest in doing survey work and focusing it on key biodiversity area species, we'd be happy to try to, write letters of support or even to try to, look for we don't have the capacity to look for funding for that necessarily, but we would certainly try to support any grant proposals in any way that we can.
I see someone else's hand is up. Joe, do you have a new question, or is that an old?
Could I touch on the Indigenous knowledge systems?
No, do you want to address that question as well?
Yeah, I was just sort of looking at it because it is important, and it's something that we haven't begun to do in Saskatchewan and Alberta, but we're hoping to get advice from Saskatchewan Nature, among others, on how to do this. We've also, so in some places where we've had partnerships, for example, in the Yukon, where we've actually completed work to identify most key biodiversity areas, we have, there was initial outreach to, there's 11 First Nations, and then to explain the Key Biodiversity Area program and invite questions. And then there was an invitation to a workshop, because at the time we were allowed to have workshops, and a number of First Nations participated in that. And so it depends on the interest of the First Nation. In some cases, it's just about informing them immediately that this is the work that we're doing, so that they can participate if they would like, and see if there's an alignment of interests in terms of, does this feed into something that makes sense, that sort of aligns with the conservation values. But in Yukon, the kind of knowledge that came into sort of the delineation of sites was around, for example, there was a key biodiversity area identified for a lake, and the representative of one First Nation was able to, adjust the boundaries of the key biodiversity area, because they requested that the spawning grounds were not included in the KBA, because they didn't want people to be aware of where those spawning grounds were, which were important to their community. So actually they were included in the KBA, but they were obscured in a way, so the boundaries of the KBA were expanded so that it wasn't obvious that it was up this one stream. So that's the kind of information that we're really interested in, but we're also interested in, so we've been approached by 2 First Nations in British Columbia who are developing proposals for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and asked whether there was a key biodiversity area in that area that could support their proposal for an IPCA, which is this Indigenous protected and conserved area, even though the impetus for that IPCA was not about key biodiversity areas, but it was being identified for biocultural reasons, but they felt that the key biodiversity area information could strengthen it and make it more appealing for funding from the government. So all knowledge is appropriate for feeding into this work, both knowledge about species locations and distributions and ecology, but also, information about the sites, information about where the boundaries should be to, and in other cases, we've actually stepped back from identifying a key biodiversity area. It's there and it will always be there, but they've asked, well, just because there's some negotiations going on, could you not continue with this work for the moment? So there's a lot of conversations going on like that. We're working with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources to also reach out and try to figure out, well, how is this most relevant to different First Nations, and how do you identify the communities that you should be talking to? Because that's one of our biggest challenges, is even knowing who to talk to across, because we're doing this work at the national level, and again, we're a small team, so we need advice, and we're seeking advice, and we're involving different communities in the process where there's interest and where there's opportunity.
Thank you, Ciara, for that answer. I see we're at about 2 minutes. I don't think there'll be a hard stop, but we will end it around then. I think this might be a good time. If there are any final questions anyone would like to unmute and ask, at this point, go ahead.
It's Lauren here again with another question or comment. One group of people that are often overlooked are elected officials. And Peter, you and certainly involved your local member of the legislature, a minister of environment, who happened to be myself at the time. And most politicians know very little about biodiversity, conservation, or whatever. They're there to keep hospitals open and schools running and things like that. If we are able to take individual elected officials out, we will get much bigger bang for the buck. Now, Peter is well aware of this, and he might even be able to comment on how he involved John Crayon.
I'll say as well, we're on the 30 minutes, so I'm going to stick around for the end of this question, but if anybody else has to go among the presenters as well, please feel free to head off now. Anyone in the audience, thank you for coming. We're really excited to continue this work with everybody. But Peter, please answer that question as the final one.
Thanks so much, Lauren, for your good question. Taking on Jacques Chrétien was not that simple, and as a matter of fact, it angered the higher level of that government at the time, to the point that when we actually got our designation from UNESCO, they chopped off all funding to assist us with projects, conservation projects on the Biosphere Reserve for several years. So that's why it's so personal. It's personal for individuals on the farmland. It's personal for politicians, and not always do those things agree. But that's a fact of life, you know. Without big guns, I think we have to just simply work with one another and try to make it work, and understand that it's not going to be perfect ever.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, well noted. Well noted. And thank you, Lauren, for that. Yeah, great question to end it off. I think we'll have to cap it there. I'm sure there's a lot more great discussions to be had around the topic, and I think everybody on the call would love to do that at a later date. We'll be following up with everybody with a recording and with emails of those who want to be contacted after as well if there are further questions. But we'll end the meeting at this point, and thank you everybody for coming. Thank you again, Michael, Peter, Ciara, and Lucy for some excellent presentations. Thanks everybody for some great questions and discussion afterwards. Any final words, Michael and Peter?
No, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for hosting, Peter.
No, thank you very much.
Terrific. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Go visit a KBA near you.